You think you understand poker. You have watched the videos. You have read the theory. You know what GTO means. You know what ranges are. You have heard the word solver so many times it feels like furniture in the room. And then you sit down to take a structured test, a real GTO diagnostic. And the score comes back showing you that you are making expensive mistakes in spots you were completely certain you had figured out. That gap between what you think you know and what the test proves you actually do is the most important space in poker development. And almost nobody talks about it honestly. Today we are going to talk about it honestly. There is a particular kind of confidence that intermediate players carry that is more dangerous than the confusion of beginners. The beginner knows they do not know. They are humble by necessity. They watch every hand with open questions. But the intermediate player has accumulated enough knowledge to feel competent. They can talk about ranges. They can explain C-bet theory. They can nod along to any poker conversation and add something reasonable. And that competence, that accumulated vocabulary, creates the feeling of understanding in situations where the understanding is still only surface deep. This is not a character flaw. It is a cognitive pattern that research and learning science calls the illusion of knowing. You have been exposed to the information enough times that it feels familiar. Familiar feels like understood, and understood feels like executable. But familiarity and execution are separated by something that no amount of passive learning can bridge. They are separated by pressure, by pattern recognition trained at depth, by the gap between knowing a principle and applying it correctly when the clock is running and real chips are on the line. Here is what this looks like in practice. A player sits down with pocket kings and faces a 4-bet from a player who has been tight all session. They know the theory. They have studied ranges. They can tell you exactly what a tight player's 4-betting range looks like and why that range includes aces heavily. And yet, in the moment, they call. Not because they forgot the theory, because the theory was never truly installed in the decision-making layer. It lived in the intellectual layer, the place where you understand things conversationally, and it had never made the journey to the execution layer, the place where decisions actually happen under pressure. This is the gap. And this is where GTO tests begin. Tools like the Peak GTO Leak Finder, created by Jonathan Little, were built around a very specific and underappreciated insight, that what most players need is not more information. They need a mirror, a structured environment that shows them exactly where their actual decision-making diverges from what optimal play requires. The test puts you through carefully selected hands that cover both pre-flop and post-flop decisions, multiple decision points per hand, real pressure at each one. And it measures not whether you know the theory, but whether you can execute it when the decision is actually in front of you. What comes back is not a grade. It is a map of exactly where your decision patterns break down, which positions create errors, which board textures trigger autopilot responses, whether your pre-flop ranges are leaking, or whether your post-flop continuation frequencies are off. The test does not measure knowledge, it measures decision behavior. And the gap between those two things is where most of the money in poker actually lives. The Peak GTO system also introduces something called an ELO score, a rating that tracks how far your decisions are from optimal across each situation you face. The closer your decisions are to the solver's output, the higher your ELO. The more you deviate from what the math says is correct, the lower it drops. What makes this powerful is that it forces you to confront something that pure study never forces you to confront. Not whether you understand GTO in theory, but whether you are actually playing it. In real decision points, in real pressure, where your emotional state and your automatic responses have more influence over what you do than any book you ever read. This is where most players discover something deeply uncomfortable and deeply useful. Before we go deeper, I want to pause here because what I am about to explain requires a foundation. And if you have ever felt the frustration of studying a lot and changing a little, this foundation is exactly what you need. Mind of a Grinder Complete system was built for the specific player we are describing, the player who has knowledge but has not yet converted it into consistent execution. 10 structured ebooks that move from the foundational understanding of how decisions are actually made under pressure, through the mental game, through range thinking, through the specific frameworks that bridge the gap between intellectual understanding and executable skill. It is a system, not a collection. A sequence built to produce real change in how you think at the table. The link is in the pinned comment. If this video is landing for you today, the system is where the work continues. Now let us go deeper into what GTO tests actually reveal, because this is where it gets genuinely interesting. There are 3 specific things that a well-designed GTO test surfaces that you cannot see from the inside while you are playing. The first is autopilot decisions. The second is emotional interference. The third is fundamental misunderstanding of ranges. All 3 are invisible to the player who has them. All 3 are immediately visible to a structured diagnostic. Autopilot decisions are what happen when your brain recognizes the surface pattern of a situation and triggers a response without doing the actual calculation the situation requires. You raise in late position because you raise in late position. You c-bet the flop because you raised pre-flop, and you always c-bet when you raise pre-flop. You fold to a 3-bet because 3-bets usually mean strength. These are not wrong in every case, but they are wrong in the specific cases where the actual variables of the situation require a different answer. An autopilot does not check the actual variables. It matches the pattern and fires. What the GTO test does is present you with situations where the surface pattern and the correct decision are pointing in opposite directions, where the automatic response is expensive, where what feels right is what costs money. And in those spots, it measures whether you notice the difference and adjust, or whether you fire the autopilot response and move on. Most players, even good ones, fail these spots more than they expect. Not because they are not smart, because the autopilot is faster than conscious reasoning. And in the context of a real session, where you are managing emotional states and energy levels and a dozen other things simultaneously, the autopilot runs more of the decisions than you realize. Emotional interference is subtler and more expensive. It shows up in GTO tests in a specific way. Players who are in a calm, focused state perform measurably better on the same decision points than they do when they are carrying emotional weight from a previous hand. The test measures the decision. It does not care about your emotional state, but your emotional state cares enormously about the decision, and it changes what you see as available, what feels right, and what you ultimately choose. Research in performance psychology, including work by Jared Tendler, whose book on the mental game of poker is still considered the most important text on this subject, shows that mild emotional activation can reduce expected value by between 20 and 60% in complex decision-making scenarios. That is not a small effect. That is the difference between a winning player and a losing one, expressed purely in terms of emotional state's impact on decision quality. In a GTO test, emotional interference shows up as inconsistency. You answer a spot correctly when it appears early in the test, in a state of calm engagement. You answer the same type of spot incorrectly when it appears later, after a sequence of challenging hands that have activated a degree of frustration or anxiety. Your knowledge did not change between those 2 moments, and your emotional state changed what you did with the knowledge. This is the player who has studied for hundreds of hours and still tilts, not because they do not know better, because the knowledge lives in a layer that tilt does not reach. The GTO test exposes this with mathematical precision, and the ELO score drops in exactly the spots where the emotional brain took over from the reasoning one. The third thing GTO tests reveal is the one that most players find most humbling. Fundamental misunderstanding of ranges. Not misunderstanding of a specific hand, misunderstanding of the entire system of thinking that GTO requires. And this misunderstanding is almost impossible to detect from the inside because it produces responses that feel completely logical from the perspective of the player making them. Here is the core concept. GTO does not think about hands. It thinks about ranges. Your range is the collection of all hands you could plausibly have in a given situation, weighted by how likely you are to hold each one. When you make a decision at the poker table, you are not making a decision about this specific hand in isolation. You are making a decision that, over thousands of repetitions of this exact situation, will produce the best average outcome across your entire range. This means that sometimes GTO says to fold a hand that is likely ahead right now. Not because this specific hand should fold, because the range of hands that should fold in this spot, as a coherent strategy, includes this hand. Removing this hand from the folding range would make the entire strategy exploitable. in a way that costs more than the equity you preserve by calling. Most players cannot make this decision because they are not thinking about the range. They are thinking about the hand. And that specific hand perspective produces decisions that feel correct in the moment and are systematically wrong across the session. Let us look at a concrete example because this is where the concept moves from abstract to operational. You are in the big blind. A competent player opens from the cutoff. You defend with 7-6 suited. The flop comes king 9-2 with 2 clubs. You check. Your opponent bets half the pot. Now the hand-thinking player looks at 7-6 suited, sees that it missed the flop, notes that the board has a king and they do not have a king, and thinks, I should fold. This feels like disciplined, correct play. The range-thinking player sees something entirely different. They are asking, on this board, given that I defended from the big blind and my opponent opened from the cutoff, what does my range look like and what does their range look like? The big blind's range contains a lot of low-connected cards, a lot of suited connectors. 7-6 suited is actually a representative hand for this range. The cutoff's range contains a lot of hands that like this board, kings, 9x, and a lot of hands that completely missed it. Their continuation bet frequency here, if they are betting their entire range, can be profitably counterattacked with a check raise at the right frequency. Folding 7-6 suited here, the disciplined play, might actually be an error if it means you are folding too frequently on this board texture and your range is becoming exploitable. The GTO test forces you to make this decision, and it measures whether your response matches what optimal range level thinking requires. What most players discover when they first engage with this seriously is that they have been playing hands for years when the game was asking them to play ranges. And that shift in perspective is not small. It changes how you read every board, every bet, every situation. Let me now explain 3 key principles that GTO tests consistently expose as gaps in intermediate player thinking, because understanding these principles changes how you approach every hand you play from this point forward. The first principle is range advantage. On any given board, one player's overall range of possible hands is stronger than the other player's range. This is not about individual hands. It is about the collection of all possible hands weighted by likelihood. When a player opens from under the gun and the board comes ace-king-queen, the opener's range is far more likely to contain aces, kings, queens, and strong ace-x hands than the caller's range. The opener has range advantage on this board, and range advantage determines the fundamental dynamics of the entire hand. Who should be betting more? Who should be checking more? What bet sizes make sense? All of it flows from which player's range connects more favorably with the board. Most intermediate players have a vague understanding that hitting the board is good. They do not have a structural understanding of how range advantage shapes the entire decision tree for both players. GTO tests measure whether your decisions reflect an intuitive understanding of range advantage, and in the majority of cases, they reveal that the decisions are made board card by board card, rather than from a range-level perspective that correctly accounts for whose overall collection of hands benefits most from the texture. The second principle is board texture and how it interacts with strategy. This is more than knowing that wet boards have draws and dry boards do not. Board texture analysis in GTO thinking requires understanding which boards hit which ranges, which boards produce nutted hands for which players, and how the arrival of each turn and river card shifts the relative strength of each player's range. A king-high dry board is very different from a king-high connected board, not just because of the draws, but because the connected board gives the out-of-position caller more hands that are strong, more sets on lower cards, more two pairs, more draws that may become the nuts. The in-position raiser's continuation betting frequency, sizing, and range composition should all shift based on these distinctions, and they shift in specific, measurable ways that GTO analysis has calculated with precision. When a GTO test presents you with hands on varied board textures, it is measuring whether your decision-making shifts appropriately with the texture, or whether you are applying a single undifferentiated approach across all boards. The player who bets every flop at the same frequency and with the same sizing, regardless of texture, is leaking expected value on almost every hand they play, in ways that are individually small but collectively enormous over thousands of hands. The equity graph feature that Peak GTO recently introduced makes this visual in a way that changes how you experience this concept. On a King 4 board, You can see the equity gap between the in-position player's range and the out-of-position player's range plotted visually. The gap is enormous, and it explains immediately why the solver recommends a high-frequency small bet. You can see the mechanics. You are not memorizing outputs. You are understanding principles, and principles transfer to every board you will ever see. The third principle is decision structure. This is the deepest and least intuitive of the three, and it is the one that separates players who study GTO from players who actually think in GTO terms. Decision structure means understanding that the action you take now is not just a response to this moment. It is a construction of a story about your range that your opponent will use to make their decisions for the rest of the hand and in future hands and across the entire session. Every bet is a sentence in a narrative. Every check is a statement. And the narrative your actions construct must be coherent, must be balanced, must contain both strong and weak hands in the right proportions, for your strategy to be unexploitable. When you always check with weak hands and always bet with strong ones, your checks become free information. Your opponent knows that when you check, you are giving up. They can bet any two cards and take the pot. When you check with strong hands at the right frequency, your checks become ambiguous. Your opponent cannot bet automatically. They have to proceed with caution, which is exactly what optimal play requires them to do. GTO tests measure your decision structure by looking at patterns across many hands. Not what you did in one spot, what you systematically tend to do across a category of spots. And the patterns they reveal are almost always more extreme than the player expected. Checking too much in certain spots, betting too frequently in others, bluffing at the wrong frequencies, calling too wide or too narrow on specific runouts. These systematic deviations are not visible from inside the session. They are only visible when you aggregate behavior across many similar situations and compare it to what optimal play requires. The test does this automatically. The ELO score captures the cumulative cost of these deviations in expected value terms. And seeing that number, watching it respond to your decisions in real time, is one of the most effective learning mechanisms that modern poker training has produced. Here is the reframe that this entire conversation has been building toward. And I want you to hear it clearly because it changes how you should think about every study session and every session at the table from this point forward. The problem is not your strategy. Your strategy might be fine. You probably know enough strategy to beat the games you are trying to beat. The problem is your thinking process. Specifically, the gap between the thinking process you believe you are running and the thinking process you are actually running when the pressure is real, when the emotional state is elevated, when the session has been running for 2 hours and your autopilot is making more decisions than your reasoning brain. GTO tests reveal this gap because they are structured to be honest with you in a way that your own perception cannot be. Your perception of your play is filtered through memory bias, through emotional coloring, through the selective recall of the hands you played well and the blurring of the ones you did not. A diagnostic test cuts through all of that. It shows you the actual decision pattern, not the one you believe you have, the one you actually produced. And what you almost always find when you engage with this kind of honest measurement seriously is that the gap between your beliefs about your play and the reality of your play is larger than you expected. Not because you are a bad player, because the human brain is not built to accurately assess its own decision-making quality in real time. It is built to rationalize, to protect, to maintain a coherent self-narrative. GTO tests are built to reveal, and the revelation is almost always both humbling and instructive. You do not lose because you do not know. You lose because you do not see. And seeing, genuine seeing, requires a mirror honest enough to show you what is actually there. That mirror exists. The tools exist. The diagnostic frameworks exist. What they require is the willingness to look and then the commitment to build, deliberately and specifically, the thinking patterns that the test reveals you are missing. Not more information. Not more content consumption. Deliberate repetition of the specific decision types where your pattern diverges from optimal, until the correct pattern is the one that fires automatically when the pressure is real. That is the work. And it is the most valuable work a serious poker player can do right now, regardless of the level they are playing at. Leave a comment telling me, what is the specific poker situation where you feel most uncertain about whether you are making the right decision? Not the most dramatic spot, The most consistently uncertain one. I read every comment. The answers you share help shape what this channel teaches next. Like this video if it gave you a new way to see the game. Subscribe to Mind of a Grinder if you want to keep going at this depth. And if you are ready to build the complete framework, the system that takes everything we discussed today and structures it into a path from where you are to where your understanding needs to be, check the pinned comment. The Mind of a Grinder Complete Collection. 10 ebooks, $29.90. The launch price. This week only. You do not lose because you do not know. You lose because you do not see. Now you see a little more. Let us keep going.